Greetings, delegates. This is another edition of PUCPMUN Academic Talks. My name is Alex Jaque. I am the director of the Central Intelligence Agency meeting for Central America, and we are accompanied by Omar Leon and Mr. Fulton Armstrong. Omar, please introduce yourself.
Good morning to the delegates. My name is Omar Leon Velázquez. In this opportunity, I'm glad to be your assistant director for this PUCPMUN conference.
Thank you. The topic of this academic talk will be the leftist revolutions on Nicaragua and El Salvador on the early years of the 80s. Mr. Fulton is going to introduce himself and start with the presentation.
Great. I'm Fulton Armstrong. I'm an adjunct professor at American University here in Washington, D.C. Speaking to you from in Washington, D.C. on our election day, a big day for us here in the United States. We'll talk about the two insurgencies, the leftist insurgencies in Salvador and Nicaragua, but primarily I talk a little bit about the role of the United States in those and the reactions that the United States adopted to those two phenomena, particularly the role of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, as Alex and Omar had asked me to prepare. One very important point is that when you talk about the role of the CIA in a situation like Central America, you cannot separate it from broader US policy. What the CIA is not an independent policy-making agency that does whatever it wants in a region like Central America. It essentially is responding to the policy requirements. To further develop that idea, I share with you that you have to remember that, as in all countries, intelligence agencies usually have two roles. One role is to collect intelligence and to analyze it and to understand what's happening in a situation. The other role is to influence events there. That's what we call the covert action or the operational role. So when you look at the role of the US government and the role of the CIA in a place like Central America in the 1970s and 80s, you have to remember that there are those two roles. And like many human beings, when you have two roles in one situation, there can be internal conflict. Because in the case of the intelligence mission, collecting and understanding, that mission, it is in conflict with the influencing mission, because one is supposed to tell the truth and be accurate. The other one is to create a new truth. That's the purpose of covert action. So those two roles, understand that. Understand also that in the time in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, frankly, even beyond 1990, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the United States saw Central America primarily through a Cold War optic. There's the legacy of colonialism, where you had the so-called Monroe Doctrine from the 1900s. Monroe Doctrine basically had two aspects. One was Latin America is our area of influence and nobody else's. And two, that Latin America, everybody else should stay out of Latin America, including Europe, Russia, China, and stuff. It's our, and back then the word that many people used was backyard. So the Cold War set up this really difficult situation for Latin America. The problem with the Cold War was that it created this prism through which everything was viewed in Latin America, especially Central America. So the leftist revolutions or the leftist insurgencies in those countries were actually seen not as homegrown problems or violence and war created by a homegrown problem with homegrown factors and drivers behind it. They were actually seen within the context of a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, which led to a series of errors. We'll go back, just wind the clock back a little bit to 1954. You had Jacobo Arbenz, the president in Guatemala, 1954, that the US government under President Eisenhower, using the CIA, very effectively removed him from power. It was a coup. The reason we say effectively is very few people got killed, very few people got hurt, and all. The problem was that behind that then came military-based regimes that were, if you say Arbenz is on X number of degrees on the left, what you had was regimes of the right, military regimes that were far, far, far right, much more to the right than he was to the left. So you would then set in motion historical challenges with with human rights, with the whole system, with the control of the elites, the lack of inclusion of the indigenous populations, which then fueled the insurgency. In the case of Guatemala, you didn't mention it, but Guatemala had a very big insurgency led primarily on the left by the URNG. The URNG was a leftist insurgency with strong indigenous roots, but also strong urban roots. But that success in 1954 led to a series of problems down the road. The human rights problems, the military regime things, the undemocratic things. With the CIA also had, the US government also had a massive failure early in those years in 1961, thinking that it would be as easy to overthrow Fidel Castro as it was to get rid of Arbenz. The CIA did a series of operations, the most famous of which and the biggest disaster of which was the Bay of Pigs, Playa Girón, it's called. So you have a mixed record, but all of this is within this Cold War mentality, to not look at what's happening inside the countries, but to see everything as a dynamic between the US and the Soviet Union. So along comes El Salvador and along comes Nicaragua, two very different countries, very different, even ethnically different countries. The indigenous role in Nicaragua is much greater. The topography is very different. The economy is different, very structured. The population density of El Salvador was intense. It was more urban. It's the most densely populated country in the region, but they both had systemic problems of very small elites controlling their political systems. And so you had the popular reactions. Yes, some of those popular reactions were encouraged by Cuba. The awareness of Cuba, they stimulated this awareness. And of course, the Soviets also were to make trouble for the US, because it was our backyard, by supporting these people, these leftist movements in Central America. It was also to harass the United States, to put us in difficult situation. But again, we were ignoring the homegrown causes. The fact that in the case of El Salvador, there were 12, 13, 14 families that controlled like 90% of the national economy. In the case of Nicaragua, the Somoza family had made itself a dynasty from father to son, and their human rights situation and the level of their corruption became massive issues. It was not that the Sandinista guerrilleros in the mountain, the Ortega brothers, and they called them the Directorio Sandinista. It's not that they were getting assistance from Cuba or the Soviets. They were, but that was not the decisive factor. There were homegrown reasons for that. And in the case of El Salvador also, there were homegrown reasons. So you have then a complex situation where the US reaction is to again deal with things, A, through intelligence channels, and B, as an East-West conflict, a US-Soviet competition. And that then led to some good things, like one of the presidents of El Salvador, Jose Napoleon Duarte, was a pretty good guy. He was a Christian Democrat. He wasn't from what is now called Arena and stuff. He was a good guy and he tried, but he was overwhelmed by the right-wing elements in the military. And what you had was, we're trying to help a pretty good guy, but working with his own military that was undermining him and committing a variety of human rights atrocities. The FMLN, the guerrillas in El Salvador, also committed human rights atrocities, but there's a difference because we were supporting the military. So if you tell the American people we're supporting democracy, but they're actually human rights violators, you then have a disconnect. What are we doing? It's not that the FMLN was good, but we weren't supporting the FMLN. We were supporting the military, and the military atrocities were huge. You probably have heard of Mosote, you probably have heard of the Jesuit killings and all. So it became very complicated. Again, we rationalized everything by making it a secret set of operations and rationalized it all by saying this was to beat back the Soviet Union. So that's the context then in which you have it. In the Contra program, once the Sandinistas had won in July 1979, the Sandinistas marched into Managua. They promised that they were social reformers, but they did have friends in Cuba. They did have friends in the Soviet Union. The US would just never acknowledge the legitimacy of their revolution. And we then supported, first with the Argentines' help, and then basically our own thing. We created the Contra Army. And the real true numbers of how many Contras there were will probably never be known. I have estimates that I can't share with you because I worked on this issue while at the CIA. But let's say that the Contras might have had some noble intentions, and they might have had some good allies, and they might have wanted to do good. But in the end, the Contra program was riddled with scandals, including human rights violations, including involvement in narco trafficking, including their own internal fights. They were not a unified force. They all basically wanted to be the gringos' agents in Nicaragua rather than being really truly Nicaraguan-based counter-revolutionary or insurgency movement. So we backed in both cases, in El Salvador and in Nicaragua, we backed people who were agents of change, who talked about democracy, but were not delivering and could not deliver. All that said, in both cases, both wars, quite miraculously, despite US opposition, signed an agreement. We called it the Acuerdo de Esquipulas, named after a little town in Guatemala, that they were doing negotiations under what was called Contadora at the time, with the president of Costa Rica being the primary facilitator. And what they did was they met secretly behind our backs, and they made a deal. And quite miraculously, that deal that the gringos would have opposed turned out to lead to a major step forward in Central America that was not part of US policy. The US had to go along with it. But in that case, the FMLN and the Arena people in Salvador agreed to a peace process that turned out to be quite significant. And as you know, Salvador has had several FMLN presidents since then. And the military was integrated, because these are not stupid people. Let's face it, Americans might treat them like stupid people, but they're not stupid people. Guatemala, a lot more complex because it's a different topography, it's a bigger country. The indigenous were never fully integrated into the political system, but they also did do a peace process that did lead to at least some improvement on the democratic side. Now, corruption remains a cancer in all of these countries, including Nicaragua, but this was a big step forward. In the case of Nicaragua, we had an amazing thing that the Sandinistas, who we basically considered to be hardened communists and totalitarians, did submit to free and fair elections. And they did hand power over to Violeta Chamorro, a successor from the opposition, whose son was involved in the Contra on the political side. And so it was really quite amazing that we had typecast these people as incapable of dealing with their problems without us doing military solutions, but they did finally do peace processes. Now, since the end of the Cold War, we have continued to find ways to characterize their problems as being primarily externally driven. For example, Americans love to say that the corruption in Central America is the product of narco trafficking. In other words, it's the product of Colombian cartels and Mexican cartels that are using their territory. It's true that the narcotraficantes did take advantage of the existing corruption and weak institutions in Central America, but they didn't make them weak and they didn't make them corrupt. And neither did Venezuela, who's now everybody loves to blame Venezuela for every problem in the hemisphere as well. So instead of looking at, when you want sort of my bottom line on the role of the United States and the CIA in Central America, you asked about Salvador, Nicaragua. When you look at it, we've made the same problem, we made the same mistake over and over, and we really haven't helped the region get to the underlying causes of their problems and then therefore find underlying solutions. So I'll close with that. I'll just remind you to remember that when you talk about CIA, you have to remember that A, CIA doesn't operate outside US policy. They're not a rogue agency. And B, CIA has two roles that sometimes are contradictory, the intelligence role and the covert action operational role. And so what you'll see is maybe they performed well on the analytical side, on the information side, but poorly on the operational side, or maybe the other way around. So I'll close with that. Welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fulton, for such a great talk. I would like to ask, and probably this is something that most of the delegates often ask themselves, how does the CIA get the funds? Regarding the operational side you mentioned, for example, how did the CIA got the funds to organize the Contras on Central America?
That's a good question. Whenever you have any legal operations done by the executive branch or an independent agency of the US government must be funded by the Congress. Only the Congress, in fact, only the US House of Representatives can originate funding or spending bills. You're not allowed to, if you're given money, if you're an agency or a department, you're given money to do program X, you cannot single-handedly, without congressional approval, go and spend that money on program Y. Okay, that's a thing. I've worked on Capitol Hill. I worked in the White House for 4 years. I worked in CIA for a bunch of years, but I also worked in the House of Representatives for 4 years and in the United States Senate. First for a guy named Joe Biden. Don't know if you've heard that name. Joe Biden, and then later for a fellow named John Kerry. But so legal operations must be funded by the US Congress. And if the government, if the administration wants to do a covert action through CIA or through another intelligence agency, they must notify the Congress. And the Congress therefore has a chance to say no. They don't have to say yes, but they do have the right to say no. Now, in the case of the Contra program, one of the scandals, one of the many scandals about the Contra program was what we called Iran Contra, that the US Congress specifically voted in early 1984 or late 1983, specifically voted on a thing that we called the Boland Amendment that explicitly prohibited the administration, this is the Reagan administration, from spending money to assist the Contras because of their human rights issues, because of the variety of administrative problems they had, their internal fighting and stuff. And behind the Congress's back, in other words, illegally, the Reagan, and this is Bush, Daddy Bush, Reagan-Bush administration secretly, through the person of a fellow named Oliver North, but it was known to the senior people in the administration, Oliver North went, and what he did was he sold some weapons to Iran and then put the profits into a secret fund for the Contra program, which was two sins, the Iran sin and then the Contra sin. They also encouraged private individuals to put their money into operations, and then they coordinated those operations. In other words, they used US government funds to run operations that might have been funded by other people, legally or illegally. That was still a violation because the US government was to provide no assistance, including coordination. So yes, it's a good question. Legally, everything has to be approved by the Congress and reported to the Congress, but the Reagan-Bush administration did violate the law during Iran-Contra. It was a big scandal. There were indictments and a couple of convictions, and of course then all of them were pardoned.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fulton. I'm sure that now the topic is clear not only for myself, but also for all the delegates that will see this record. Omar, I was wondering, maybe you could ask.
Yes, excuse me. Yes, I have a question. In your opinion, what was the greatest difficulty that the CIA had in its operation against the Frente de Liberación Nacional Sandinista? For example, the logistic, the difficulty of the zone, or the strategy of the FLNs?
Okay, say again, because you broke up there for a second. The difficulties that the US government or CIA had In which operations?
Excuse me, the operations of the zone and the strategy of the Frente de Liberación Nacional Sandinista.
So in other words, the operations that were intended to defeat the FSLN, the Sandinistas,
Yes.
including the Contra program and political programs and diplomatic programs. I mean, there were a lot of efforts against them. And I know, and I've met with Humberto Ortega, Daniel's brother, who was Minister of Defense for many years. And he and I have talked about the history of that time. And he's a very interesting man. He's quite the statesman now, and has a different perspective on where Nicaragua should go than his brothers. And the funny thing is that Humberto and I were talking, because I was part of CIA during the Contra era, and he said, you know, we never understood each other. Said, you saw us as Soviet agents and Cuban agents, and we saw you as out to destroy not just our relationship with with Russia and Cuba, but to destroy our revolution and to bring back a Somoza type regime. And he said to me, he said, I was really shocked. They were 30 years old, 31, 32 years old. They were basically kids, with all due respect to you guys, when you're 30 years old and stuff. And he said, you saw us as being such monsters, but we were scared. We were scared kids. We didn't really know what we were doing, but you dealt with us as you're so great. But we did try the Contra War. We did try diplomatic strategies, including the Contadora process and steering Contadora toward our goals rather than the region's goals. We did try other covert operations. We did try diplomatic efforts to show the whole world the Sandinistas' human rights problems. We did do a bunch of things. And the toughest part, I think, was the Contra program and disciplining people who were not disciplined, who didn't have a shared view, who didn't understand democracy, didn't even sometimes understand their own history and their own people, because they tended to be from isolated parts of society that they had never been out to, Matagalpa and to Jinotega and to out to the mountainous areas and dealt with the real peasants. So the Contras didn't have the local peasant support that usually you would have an insurgency, a guerrilla-based type insurgency have. And so it was really just a bad idea from the beginning.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fulton, for the academic talk. The topic and the way you exposed it to us was just amazing. We are very grateful that you were here helping us to understand more about this complex conflict that happened among Central America, and especially the role the Central Intelligence Agency had on it. Thank you very much.
Good. Have a good time. Remember that these lessons of history are lessons for today, that we should look when we look at regions like this, and you do your model UN, we look at regions like this, we shouldn't be repeating the mistakes of the past, we should be correcting them. So including, for example, on migration issues, we should be looking at the real causes inside the country and not blame outside people. We should be looking at what's really going on in these countries. So thanks very much. It's a real pleasure. I love Model UN activities. Good luck. Hope you guys pass good resolutions and that your teams, your delegates perform brilliantly. Thank you.
Thank you very much.